Welcome to today's lesson, Evidence for Evolution. Darwin took his life's work and collected all his information and wrote about his theory of evolution in a book called On the Origin of Species. And in this book, he provided evidence that evolution has taken place. Since Darwin's time, we found other evidence for evolution, and we find that evidence in the fossil record, in DNA, and in biochemistry. In this lesson, we'll look at the evidence for evolution. The first piece is fossil evidence. Fossils are like a window to the past. If you look at older fossils and newer fossils, you can see how a species has changed over time. The scientists who study fossils are called paleontologists. On this picture, you can see the evolution of the modern horse, which you can see here. And as you go back in time, you can see that the animal looked different. Its ancestor looked different. And you can see the teeth has evolved over time. And you can see how the bone structures have changed over time to result in the modern horse. We can look at lots of organisms in this way, examining fossil evidence to see how that organism changed throughout history. The second piece of evidence comes from living species that are alive today. Comparative anatomy studies similarities and differences in structures of different species. And we'll take a look at each of these one at a time: homologous structures, analogous structures, vestigial structures, and then finally DNA and protein evidence. So these are homologous and analogous structures. Homologous structures are similar in related organisms, and they're similar because they were inherited from a common ancestor. They might have very different functions, but the same structure. Here is a classic picture showing homologous structures. This is a human's arm, a cat's leg, a whale, and you have a bat's wing. And these are each used for drastically different things. The human can use their arm to do all kinds of work and use tools. The cat uses it for walking, the whale for swimming, and the bat for flying. So different functions, but if you look at it, the structure is very similar. You can see that these similar bones are shaded in the same color. There's the orange, which you find in each one, and then this light peach color. So there's a lot of similarity between the structures, even though the functions are different. And the reason why is because all of these organisms are mammals. They share a more recent common ancestor with each other than they do with other organisms. On the right-hand side are analogous structures. These are structures that are similar in unrelated organisms, and they're similar because they evolved to do the same job. They have the same function, but a different structure. So bats and birds are actually not very closely related. And you can see that even though they both have wings, which are used for flying, the structure of those are very different from each other, whereas the bat is more similar to other mammals like us. Okay. The next example, the next evidence from living species is comparative embryology. Embryology is the study of similarities and differences in embryos of different species. Similarities indicate common ancestry. For example, all vertebrate embryos have gill slits and tails. Many organisms lose these traits by adulthood, which of course we know. Humans no longer have gills once they're born, but they did as embryos, which is super, super strange. We also used to have a tail, which disappears during embryonic development. So that's very strange, and it indicates that we're closely related to each other, even though we look very different as adults. The next one is vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures in which evolution has reduced their size because the structures are no longer used. An example of this is the human tailbone, right? So our ancient ancestors probably had a tail which became reduced in size until it was smaller and smaller and smaller, and today our tailbone is vestigial. It doesn't really serve a function of holding a tail anymore. Scientists believe that the appendix is also a vestigial structure, as there's a couple other ones, like some of our wisdom teeth, for example, are left over from the evolutionary process. In the past, we probably had a bigger jaw and actually used those teeth for crushing. We don't need them anymore, and the wisdom teeth now cause more problems than the good that they do. They are an example of a vestigial structure. And then the last piece is DNA and protein evidence, which is very, very strong. Scientists can compare pieces of DNA. Similar sequences are the strongest evidence for evolution from a common ancestor. So we can find out what the ancestors or what the related species of an organism are by looking at similarities and differences in their DNA. For example, we can see through DNA evidence that dogs evolved from the gray wolf. Scientists study similarities also not just in DNA sequences, but in amino acid sequences. So they look at how similar proteins are between different organisms. Here is an example of a vestigial structure. This is the human appendix, which we don't really use for a whole lot of things anymore. It's kind of just left over. And in the past, you can see the appendix of a horse. You can see it's much stronger, and that appendix probably helped the horse eat. It helps the horse digest its food. And since our diet changed, we no longer need the appendix. Here's another example of a vestigial structure. So this is a skink that has these functionless arms that are no longer really used. They're really small, but they indicate that the ancestor of this skink probably had fully formed arms and legs that it used, and over time they have gotten smaller and smaller. Here is a chart showing similarities in certain proteins. This is specifically in hemoglobin molecules, and you can see similarities between these organisms in the order of their proteins, of their amino acid sequences. Here is a comparison of DNA and sequences in humans and in mice. And scientists do this. They line them up next to each other to look at similarities and differences and figure out which species are more closely related, which are less closely related. The more spelling similarities, the more closely related. So we have most DNA in common with a chimpanzee, whereas we have less DNA in common with something like a mouse or a plant. The next piece of evidence involves biogeography, and this is a study of how and why plants and animals live where they do. One example of biogeography as evidence for evolution involves the camel. So all camels descended from a North American ancestor, and these camels migrated to East Asia, to Africa, to South America, and they evolved adaptations for their particular environments. So this is what we mean. So the ancient ancestor lived in North America, right here, and they migrated all over the world, and we can find versions of the camel in these parts of the world, but we call them different things. Okay, this is the camel in Africa. This is the camel we find in Asia, and the llama is also an ancestor, or descendant rather, of the camel, which is the one that we find in South America. Okay, so continuing with biogeography, Darwin studied finches on the Galapagos Islands, which are these small birds. And all of these birds descended from a single South American species that ate seeds. When the birds arrived in the different islands in the Galapagos, they each evolved into different species, and they became adapted to their environment and to the diet that they could find on that island. And this is called adaptive radiation, how a single species evolves into many species to fill available niches. Here is what we mean. This is the original ancestor finch from South America. It flew to all these different islands, and on these islands it evolved to have a different beak, a size, and shape based on the kind of food that was available on that island. So it shows us that the bird was able to evolve into different species, and that in that sense is an evidence for evolution. And Darwin was able to bring back samples of each of these types of finches with him back to England, and he incorporated this in his book. So for example, these birds eat fruit. This bird is adapted to eating grubs. This is a very smart bird. It's adapted to using tools. This bird is on an island with lots of insects. This bird eats leaves. So you can see adaptive radiation in Darwin's finches. So these are the pieces of evidence that we have for evolution. Thank you so much for listening.